California State University, Fresno. We'll then go to Ayan Chakraborty, who is affiliated with JNU in New Delhi. Then we will go to Cogen Bohanec, who is affiliated with both the Arihanta Institute and Claremont School of Theology. And we will conclude with Abu Taher, who is at the University of the West in Southern California. And Saminiji, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So we can give you each your full half hour. We'll just be on a little bit longer than we had originally thought. So thank you for your patience.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Chris Chappell. I hope you can hear me. We have a variety of papers in this panel, so it'll be very interesting. Different time periods, different focus, but I think we'll all come together. So the title of my paper is Booker T. Washington and Mohandas K. Gandhi's Model Communities Toward the Goal of Bringing Order in Disorder. So this is a work in progress. So I just want to preface it with a couple of sentences. A number of scholars and historians have analyzed Gandhi's influence on various African American leaders and also on the civil rights movement in the United States. But I am going to go the other way. I'm going to show in this paper the deep influence of one of the prominent African American leaders on Gandhi. So this is one of the earliest influences on Gandhi. And that individual's name is Booker T. Washington. I wonder how many of you have heard about that name?
Yes.
It's very not known in the Gandhi context, so it's just researchers. I would love to get your feedback. So Booker T. Washington, 1856 to 1915, and Mohandas K. Gandhi, 1869 to 1948, although contemporary part of their lives, lived worlds apart in different environments. However, they share the moral and economic disorder caused by racism and colonialism against African Americans and Indians in the British colonies, including South Africa and in India. So I purposely didn't do any slides because it's hard to do, when you are audience in the room and on the Zoom. Instead of acquiescing to the external forces, they both work to create parallel systems for creating self-reliant and defiant communities. In a 1903 Indian Opinion article titled From Slave to University President, Gandhi writes about the life, resilience, and work of Booker T. Washington. Gandhi was deeply influenced by Washington's Tuskegee Institute, which later on came to be known as Tuskegee University. That included the trade education and training in being self-reliance and resistance to injustices for the slaves of the United States. Gandhi found an exemplary model in Washington and in his writings addressed him as our hero. Inspired by his model, Gandhi, in his earlier career, established communes in South Africa, namely Phoenix Farm and Tolstoy Farm, and later he established ashrama communities in India. Through Gandhi's writings and historical resources, this paper will focus on the efforts of Washington and Gandhi to address the disorder caused by racist and colonial oppression that had relegated African Americans and Indians to subhuman status, depriving them of any agency. First, I expand on the specific ways Gandhi sought to apply Washington's exemplary methods for building institutions, providing vocational training, and creating an education system based on the principles of equity. Second, I will explore that Washington's example helped Gandhi to see the parallels between India's customs of untouchability and the United States color-based racism, both of which dehumanize to a group of people causing moral disorder. Finally, this paper reveals the value of interchange between various groups addressing economic, moral, and social disorder. So in other words, there are alliances and that we can learn from one another. And that time, we didn't have social media. We didn't have any television that he was watching. It was all through people met Booker T. Washington or knew about him from the United States, traveled to South Africa, traveled to England, and through their writings and works, they were finding out about one another. Even though Gandhi never set foot in the US, a Black African American Black American Booker T. Washington proved to be one of the strongest allies who helped to reevaluate his own culture's prejudices and also to inspire him to create the systems of self-reliance within the structures of social and economic oppression. I trust that these historic examples will offer new insights for our contemporary time. So the work is not done. The work is continuously being done. So the first I focus on building communal institutions, Washingtonian elements. Throughout his life, Gandhi established 4 public communities: Phoenix Settlement in South Africa around 1904, Tolstoy Farm, South Africa, 1910, Sabarmati Ashram in India, 1915, and Sevagram Ashram in 1936. A number of studies analyze the impact of Count Tolstoy and John Ruskin's prospective philosophies on the early communities, as well as the influence of the Indian model of ashrams on Gandhi's communes in India. However, it is not widely known that Washington inspired Gandhi to build institutions that simultaneously engender self-discipline and address economies, education, racial, social, and political injustices. Gandhi's public communities became the vehicle for mobilizing his principles for confronting the chaos caused by slavery and socially oppressive systems. Carlin MacLean, who does a great work on Gandhi's ashrams and his communes, she terms Gandhi's communities as intentional communities. She quotes Ajay Sakaria, who sees Gandhi's communities as focusing on nonviolent neighborliness, which seeks to build relations through the paradigm of tapasya and self-suffering, or generally literally is heat, the heat of working hard, and really they were doing labor. Spiritually, tapasya, self-suffering, is oriented toward transforming the chaos of mental tendencies into an orderly, serene mind. In Gandhi's context, the heat of self-suffering in service melts away the otherliness. He argues that whereas liberal politics produces a neutral, shared space that seeks to transcend difference, Gandhi's neighborly nationalism instead acknowledges the difference between neighbors and seeks to create relations of friendship among them. So the influence of Washington's model on Gandhi's conception of his own communes in South Africa and later in India cannot be underestimated. In the year 1903, when Gandhi first learned about Washington, he also conceived a plan for his commune, the Phoenix Farm, outside of Durban. So it's very fascinating. He's reading on the one hand about Washington, on the other hand, the same time he's creating his commune. His Nico Slate suggests the connection between Gandhi's founding of the Phoenix settlement and his admiration for Washington. I quote, Gandhi's lifelong emphasis on rural education and the dignity of labor, first evident in the Phoenix settlement, resulted in part of his admiration for both Washington and Dubé. Dubé was also a South African individual who was doing the similar things. He was also influenced by Washington. So in 1904, Gandhi established his first community, Phoenix Settlement. Significantly, Gandhi chooses the name of his first commune from the Western mythology, not from Indian legends. The mythical bird phoenix rises out of its ashes to live again. It doesn't die. The bylaws of Phoenix Settlement Trust mention promoting the philosophy of Tolstoy and John Ruskin's work. Gandhi usually drew on social philosophies of these authors and who themselves were from the aristocratic backgrounds. But they did not provide any examples for building cooperative communities. So here I find this, that even though he's philosophically being influenced by them, but the Washington gives a example, the real example. Mark Thompson writes, Ruskin and Gandhi stood for the dignity of the individual, and both sought a renaissance of moral values as a basis of all action. Yet there are subtle differences in their views of an ideal society. Ruskin not only held the commoner to be inferior, but favored an aristocratic hierarchy. And these institutes are not hierarchical. Tolstoy also argued against ownership of private property and presented a somewhat socialist economy, but he fails to, Tolstoy argued against ownership of private property and presented a somewhat socialist economy, but he fails to provide any systematic planning to build grassroots economies and communities to fight economic, social, and racial inequalities. Gandhi's Phoenix Farm and other communes resemble the vision of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute model. Tolstoy and John Ruskin provided theoretical framework, but Washington offered an action plan that sought to disrupt hierarchical structure. And that's my thesis. Even though he's learning philosophically, Booker T. Washington is providing a plan. Gandhi's Phoenix Settlement confronted any hierarchical order and sought to create a social framework where all were equal. His vision is reflected in the name Phoenix, suggesting resilient rising of those who were left in the ashes, and his vision is stated in the bylaws of the Settlement Trust. So here I provide excerpts from his bylaws. So first one is, so far as possible, to order their lives as to be able ultimately to earn their living by handicraft or agriculture, carried on without aid so far as possible of machinery. So no machinery, you do by hand, hard work, labor. Second is to work publicly so as to promote better understanding between Europeans and British Indians established in South Africa. And Washington is doing the same. He's not really looking down, which later on the African-American leaders do. He really wants to have friendship with white Americans and the African-Americans. And another bylaw is to establish a school for the education, principally of Indian children, mainly through their own vernaculars. So the language should be sustained. And then the sixth is to establish a sanatorium and hygienic institute and with a view to the prevention of disease by methods generally known as nature treatment. Again, going back to indigenous ways of healing. And finally, to train themselves generally for the service of humanity, not just for Indians, but service of humanity. These are some of the bylaws of Phoenix Farm. So what I'm doing in this research that I have not seen it done yet before, so I'm just doing the parallels, and I don't have time to show the bylaws of the Tuskegee Institute, but it's very interesting to see the similar things in both. So Booker T. Washington also emphasized the value of physical labor and handicraft that nurture personal autonomy and community coherence. He says, with regard to industrial education, during the 25 years I have been working at Tuskegee, I have become more and more convinced as I have gained a more extended experience of the value of the education that is imparted through systematic training of the hand. Now we are talking about Gandhi, who is doing handicraft hand. Here is an American. His Tuskegee Institute, as I'm reading, it's just fascinating to see the similarity. Gandhi does credit Booker T. Washington in his inspiration for his vision combining vocational and academic education. Gandhi says, no originality is claimed for the method advocated here. Booker T. Washington tried it with considerable success. If I recollect rightly, even the higher education he gave was self-supporting, not simply be the armchair philosophers or high status jobs, but keep the labor going. Gandhi's lifelong defense of natural and non-mechanized methods of labor parallel Washington's justification for using traditional methods for developing trade skills. Washington writes in his autobiography, my plan was not to teach them to work in the old way, but to show them how to work the forces of nature, air, water, steam, electricity, horsepower, etc., and assist them in their labor. Gandhi also founded his Swadeshi program, also that was relied on the natural resources. While Washington's plan offered more modern techniques, Gandhi rejected modern technology in the fear of causing unemployment to millions of Indian workers. Gandhi himself practiced craftsmanship for all sorts and took on all labor tasks. He was a successful lawyer by 1903, and he committed himself to learning various trades and making them a part of the communal living for the uplift of all. His reflections on Washington shows his regard for the exemplary work that was done by him. I quote, Mr. Washington might have chosen another career in which he might have shown perhaps better in the estimation of some. But he chose, first of all, to raise his people, to qualify them for the great task lying before them. With himself, he has raised his own countrymen also immeasurably. And he said to them, as needed to indeed to all of us who care to study his life, an example worthy to be followed. And this is again 1904. So he's setting, him as an example, and he lives so far away from where Booker T. Washington was living. So now I'm going to focus on the second point, the Gandhi's new understanding of the race and untouchability, Washington's deep influence. Gandhi's understanding of race and caste owed much to his over 40 years of interest in the work of Booker T. Washington, writes Nico Slate. This statement encapsulates Washington's influence on Gandhi's views on race and the practice of untouchability. As mentioned earlier, Gandhi's writings show his sustained engagement with Washington's example, who himself rose up from slavery and uplifted his fellow African Americans through his creative educational methods. Gandhi grew up in Hinduism, and its caste system traditionally has led to hierarchical social structures and the practice of untouchability. Untouchability indiscriminately relegates a group of people to the lowest status, menial labor, and at times inhumane conditions because of their hereditary status. Various civil rights activists and scholars draw similarities between race and caste-based discrimination. During his visit to India in 1959, Martin Luther King Jr. was introduced to the public as an untouchable. That was in the South India, signaling the segregating nature of both untouchability and the Jim Crow laws in the American South. Gandhi received his education in colonial India and practiced law in the colonizer's legal structure and considered the white race superior to Indians and Indians superior to native South Africans. He had internalized racism and considered British Indians superior to native South Africans at that time. Furthermore, the hierarchic laws engendered friction among the colored races. And there's much been written on that how it took him a while to get over that kind of mindset. In 1910, Indian Opinion article, War Against the Colored Races, he suggests Washingtonian influence. In this article, Gandhi brings attention to the recent mandate that the Johannesburg municipality has been asked to remove every Indian and native employee, no matter how faithful his services may be, and no matter what their length. So everybody should be taken out of the municipality because they were Indians or people of color. Gandhi also cites the South African news reporting racist laws oriented to wage war against the colored races races, in the South Africa. Gandhi offers as an example of Booker T. Washington, who progressed despite the racist political and legal system in the United States. In 1933, Ramchandra Rao, an upper caste Hindu, writes a letter proposing a plan to establish a Seva Vidyalaya service school or an Indian Tuskegee on the American model. So now we are going 30 years fast forward in time. Is he forgetting him? Now he's in India. So what Gandhi says, I have your letter. I wish you every success in producing an Indian Tuskegee. I knew much about Booker T. Washington even when I was in South Africa, and I have great regard for him. You have kept before you a worthy model, but you cannot be an Indian Booker T. Washington. Only Harijan can be that, which is untouchable. So you can't be just be somebody implanted there unless you have experienced yourself that kind of racism. Therefore, you have to devote yourself, might and main, to the task of producing from among Harijans to prototype of Booker T. Washington. Then you will succeed. So you got to have don't just be the leader there because he was a Hindu, caste Hindu, and he says, no, you got to bring the Harijans forward and install them as the leaders of that institute. Clearly, the examples of Washington had made Gandhi cognizant of the dynamics between the oppressor and the oppressed classes. He feared the danger of upper caste Hindus to take on the task of saving the marginalized. But the 1940s, Gandhi had many contacts with African-American leaders, including Howard Thurman, but he always turned to Washington for inspiration when he says, Booker T. Washington has shown to the world what a man of a despised race can do in the teeth of enormous odds. He was able to build that noble edifice at Tuskegee because of his limitless faith and equally limitless application. Gandhi was aware that Indians held inferior attitudes because they had been despised by the colonial authorities claiming superior civilization. This demonstrates the value of interchange among various groups and individuals addressing economic, moral, and social disorder. So Gandhi is influenced by Tolstoy, Ruskin, Booker T. Washington. Then African-American leaders like Thurman, King, Lawson are influenced by Gandhi then. So it is a go back and forth, not just one way. Even though Gandhi never set foot in the US, a Black American Booker T. Washington proved to be one of the strongest allies who helped to reevaluate his own culture's prejudices and also to inspire him to create the systems of self-reliance within the structures of social and economic oppression. Toward the end of his life, Gandhi announced, I do not want anarchy or chaos. I must work for orderliness, not anarchy. But if in that attempt anarchy comes in my way, I would not be deterred by it. The world is thrilled by the reckless bravery of the Japanese. Far greater, this is the World War II is going on, far greater courage and bravery are expected of nonviolence at this juncture. if the law of the jungle is to be replaced by the law of love. The law of love brings orderliness, and the forces of war and violence, discrimination, racism lead to the unending cycle of chaos. And both Washington and Gandhi offered methods to secure order. Thank you.
Thank you. And because we started about 15 minutes late, we will go for a question or two. I would just like to start by thanking Veena for bringing this forward. And my question is, did Tuskegee Institute include residential quarters for the students? And did that influence Gandhi's design of his ashrams?
When you said, oh yeah, the students lived there. There were housing for students. And in my longer paper, I write that Gandhi faced bigger challenges because Gandhi's Phoenix Farm and Tolstoy Farm communities, Indian communities from different backgrounds, different regions. So there were South Indians, there were North Indians, there were Hindus, there were, all kinds of background. Where in Tuskegee Institute, all were African Americans. So the work was, and they all were Christians. So it's very different than, in a way Gandhi had a much harder path than I think Booker T. Washington did, with regard to the Tuskegee Institute and the Phoenix Farm.
Great. Other questions, Maureen? Yeah, Cogen.
What a fantastic presentation, Dr. Howard. I really, really enjoyed that. I guess my question's twofold. In African American history, like when you take it as an undergraduate, as in like a college course, there's often this sort of like Fordova-Paksha relationship between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and the upliftment strategy of African Americans, where Booker T. Washington was very much a bottom-up, build the skills, build the economic development, self-reliance, create economy, create businesses, small businesses, versus W.E.B. Du Bois sort of critiqued that as keeping African Americans at the lower strata of society and had a much more class-based approach to upliftment, where he believed that African Americans should be learning Latin and Greek and, going to Harvard and, sort of occupying the upper strata of society so that they can, lift people up. So I guess my question is, number one, did Gandhi ever talk about W.B. Du Bois in this context? Was he aware of that sort of polemic? And also, is there like an Indian equivalent of the W.E.B. Du Bois? Like, is there somebody, because like I think I see Gandhi's sort of theology as being very sort of folksy, popular. He doesn't really, cite, and he doesn't like study Sanskrit. He's not a pundit, He has kind of a very loose way of dealing with religious philosophical conflicts. He seems to have a very sort of grassroots approach. Is there an Indian sort of equivalent there that we might think of to W.B. Du Bois?
These are great questions, Cogen. Thank you. He doesn't know much about Washington except he read his autobiography. And he's learning from Holmes when his good friend, comes to, and Holmes writes an article, then he reads about it, and then he just really gets excited. I mean, think about it, he's earlier in his career. But I do see I think that's why I have this larger project, because there's so much similarities. Gandhi's also not asking people to go to law school, including his own son. He tells him not to go to law school, just go, you don't need even. So he goes on tour all his life to be more, like you said, grassroots or indigenous way of doing things rather than just learning Latin or Sanskrit. So W.B. Du Bois and Gandhi had correspondence quite a bit in 1930s and late 1920s. That's and that's a whole different ways that he publishes that in Crisis, his periodical. But if you see who is like W.B. Du Bois to Booker T. Washington, who can be? Tagore. I mean, Tagore is completely elite and he's Nobel laureate and he's, going to all these, fancy places and, and there were, Bose was, many, Gandhi had not one Du Bois. Gandhi had critiques and critics in big basket, big full of rooms. They were not like one or two. And they were saying, what are you going to do? You're to take us to the Middle Ages. You're asking us to just live so simply. But now when we look at the world, I mean, what he was giving, not exactly like a blueprint following Gandhi, but if we didn't suck up all the oil in the world, if we didn't take away resource the way we are taking, then we would be a different world. I know it sounds really wonderful to, we call it progress, right? But he called it digression. Is we digress, we are not progressing. So, and he thought, what is the use of Latin and Sanskrit if you don't know your regional languages? Because the regional languages are through which we express and we live, and otherwise we are doing violence to. So I have a whole section in this project is on plurality of languages and regional dialects. He's so much into not speaking English. He's so much into using your own vernaculars. He's a polyglot. He's learning so many languages, regional languages. So it's quite fascinating that your question will be part of my more expanding the project. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So let's move on now to Ayan Chakraborty and his paper, Demystifying Aesthetics as the Political.
Hello, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. Regards to everyone. So my paper is entitled as Gandhi's Abhinay, Demystifying Aesthetics as the Political. So in this paper, I'm trying to locate Gandhi through three sections. The first section is trying to look at Gandhi and trace him through the idea of violence and non-violence, as Walter Benjamin also talks about it in his will be to trace Gandhi through Walter Benjamin, and I'll refer to a couple of texts to understand how I'm endeavoring to ground Gandhi in this regard. The second section will try to look at the inefficacy of language and the idea of rationality and faith, which would probably look quite insufficient to understand Gandhi's ism or Gandhivad, as we say. And the final argument in my paper would be to locate Gandhi through an understanding of his aesthetics, which is, I contend, a part of his political understanding and his political performance. So yeah, the ideas of order and disorder revolve around law, and they are informed by it. The legal apparatus that constitutes and categorizes its subjects is generally considered to be a direct expression of the state and is both an extension and emanation from it. If law is understood to be the conduit of serious communication between the state and its subjects, the legality involves a process of encoding or decoding, which also inquires into the very foundation of power. The same foundations which Jacques Derrida calls mystical in his seminal work, Force of Law, the Mystical Foundations of Authority. In this text, Derrida insinuates that law is merely and majestically the force on which the state ensures an idea of discipline amongst its subjects. It prescribes and revises the nuances of freedom or restraint, attempts to achieve a sort of homogeneity and replicability through its generic appeal, and intends to regularize individual tendencies of its subjects by treating them as a mass. This is both for classification and control. Hence, law succeeds by depersonifying individual subjectivities to an impersonal, even inhuman method of engagement. To Derrida, then, laws are constructed to the service of power and are guided by it. This depersonification, which is enabled by the legal apparatus, is at the cynosure of the relationship between the state and its citizens, which is in turn secured through the legal performances of repetition and rituals that have a singular telos, the perpetuation of sovereignty of the state and the ruler, of course, and the continuation of what is termed as a relatively static socio-political order. This force, which is enabled by the state and preserved by it, is what Derrida identifies as authority. However, Jacques Derrida perhaps revises on the German theorist Walter Benjamin when he asserts that it is justice that is antagonized with a depersonifying character of law. In other words, the abstract essence of what constitutes the term justice is both subjective and deeply personal. This would mean that justice is not homogeneous or quantitative at all, but it may share culturally mediated relations between an individual, his society, the state, it would also include the personal and popular notions of faith, personal fancies, and even individual imagination. Therefore, Derrida explores the necessity of understanding of each individual in his own particular relation to an event and the experience which arises from such relation. Notwithstanding the serious engagement with the otherwise anarchist Walter Benjamin established with Judaic thought, courtesy his regular epistolary exchanges with his close associate Gershom Scholem, Benjamin defined law only in terms of force and violence. In his Critique of Violence, 1921, Benjamin founds law on state violence, that which Derrida had identified to be mystical, and explains it on two planks, lawmaking and law preserving. The first is based on the extermination of the unique and diverse individual identity of the ruled, so much so that it is used as an instrument of state control. This, however, leaves probabilities for political contingencies and hence for the formation of newer laws. The second caters to perpetuation of such laws to preserve the institution of the sovereign order. This violence, which is built on state force, as Derrida points out, is repetitive and ritualistic. In opposition to this understanding, Benjamin anticipates violence, which is liberating and even messianic. It nullifies the replicability in favor of diversity and exclusiveness of each individual event and its relation to every participant or witness of that event. This violence is what he terms as messianic. Messianic violence to Benjamin is a spontaneous violence of the people. However, it is radically different from ordinary conceptions of violence in that he calls it annihilating, which strikes without quote-unquote spilling out blood. In this context, Benjamin's ideas may be traced back to his belief in the promise of the Judaic God who enters the otherwise remote human history to destroy the existent order of oppression. Thus, it is the divinity that enters into materiality of quotidian life for salvation or emancipation of the masses. This promise of a Messiah and this transformatory politics is what he understands to be Messianic violence. In this context, there are at least a couple of ideas that we can derive from Benjamin's suggestions. To begin with, law, like all other socio-political forces, derives itself from violence, even if it appears to be far more nuanced and insidious in character. Second, he allows the idea of political disruption or disorder to be understood as legitimate and as contentious in form as law itself, and thus challenges the almost monolithic legitimacy of the state even in the face of oppression. Finally, Benjamin's anti-oppressive messianic conceptions leave space for cultural or spiritual religiosities as significant approaches for anti-establishment movements. What is equally intriguing in this conception of messianic violence is his understanding of history. For instance, in his theological political fragment, Benjamin proposes the conception of messianic time, where he theorizes the former as time within history, which is contingent with emancipatory politics. It is interesting to note that Benjamin cognizes this time of time and politics in terms of religion, without having a fundamentalist purpose altogether. This would signify a greater significance of theological literature, which may be read in terms of anti-oppressive politics, which is both progressive and soteriological in nature. The final text by Benjamin, which would also be important in this presentation, will be his essay called The Destructive Character. And this is a very interesting piece that I came across during the course of my research. In this particular essay, he actually lists down almost a catalog of qualities which he supposes or almost imagines or anticipates rather in a character who would actually change, quote unquote, the entire course of history. He, almost in a vein of prophecy, puts before his readers a catalogue that would represent what he calls a destructive character. Interestingly, he calls this character a historical man who admits to the probabilities of wrong courses in action and the difficult turns of history. He raises himself against the traditionalists to make room for alternative possibilities. He destroys that which is untouchable or sacred or both, and equally so much so that the rubble of ruins manifests into a hope for reliability from within the oppressed themselves. He makes them practical and liquidates them. He lives within a life of disposition where he sees nothing permanent but resists personal suicide and social degradation. He seeks to root out the wretchedness of a particular socio-historical condition, but he is not interested in knowing what will replace once the condition is destroyed. In other words, the destructive character is beyond the philosophical epistemologies of concrete ideology. My argument revolves precisely around this fact. I contend that what Benjamin anticipates in such a messianic or historical figure in future time may have been an event in history around that very period. This figure cuts across geopolitical spaces to his long socio-political journey across India, the South African continent, and also Britain. He is the subject of this paper. His politics is the messianic event. Like Benjamin touted, M.K. Gandhi had embarked on a search for an alternative experience of time through his very conception of history. For in his seminal text, Gandhi redefines history as, quote, history as we know it is about the records of the wars in the worlds, how kings played, how they became enemies of each other, how they murdered each other, is found accurately recorded in history. And if this were all that happened, it would have been ended long ago. If the story of the universe had commenced with wars, not a man would have been found alive today. The fact that there are so many men still alive in the world shows that it is based not on the force of arms, but on the force of truth or love, unquote. He adds on, quote, history is really a record of every interruption of the even working of the force of love or the soul, unquote. This he talks about in his Hind Swaraj, of course. Now, Gandhi's understanding of messianic time is not located in future at all. Like Benjamin's destructive character, he clears away the traces of his own time and condition. Similarly, Gandhi resists a sanitized obsession with understanding when he avers, quote, I am not at all concerned with appearing to be consistent in my search after truth. I have discovered many ideas and learned many times. I have no feeling that I've ceased to grow inwardly or my growth will stop at the dissolution of my flesh, unquote. Again, Gandhi calls himself, quote, a practical idealist, unquote, as he recounts his tryst with reason during the episode catering to his encounter with caste elders before his voyage to Southampton in England. In his autobiography, he records, quote, I do not think it is all against our religion to go to England. I intend going there for further studies, and I have solemnly promised to my mother to abstain from the three things you fear most. I'm sure the vow will keep me safe. I think that caste should not interfere in this matter, unquote. This is from his autobiography, page number 34-35, the story of my experiments with truth. Let us look at the second instance. This relates to Gandhi's stay in Britain when Gandhi was interacting with his Christian friends regarding the doctrines and ethics of Christianity. When insisted by his friends to believe in Jesus as the only path to salvation, Gandhi says, quote, if this be the Christianity acknowledged by all Christians, I cannot accept it. I do not seek redemption from the consequences of my sin. I seek to be redeemed from sin itself. Until I have attained that end, I shall be content to be restless. Again from his autobiography, which is chapter 2. The third case is during the Boer War when Gandhi, then already a proponent of ahimsa or non-violence as we call it, had decided to back the British troops in medical services despite his personal sympathies being with the Boers. Again from his autobiography, part 3. In a passage, Gandhi reads through the British national anthem, I taught the national anthem to the children of my family. Later on, the text began to jar on me. The lines, which are, scatter her enemies and make them fail, confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks, particularly jarred upon my sentiment of ahimsa. How could we assume that the so-called enemies were knavish? And because they were enemies, were they bound to be in the wrong? Question, quote, unquote. The same Gandhi who appeared audacious to challenge the rigidities of a colonial or imperialist system, axioms from Christian theology or Hindu caste rigidity, refused to relocate morality in social systems alone. To him, morals were personal and akin to truth, truth being another term which Gandhi associated with his personal experiences. When he narrates his first experiences with the Hindu text Manusmriti, which is quite a controversial text also in a way, he confesses his being unimpressed and his immediate inclination towards atheism. He narrates, quote, there was a cousin of mine for whose intellect I had great regard. To him, I turned with my doubts, but he could not resolve them. But one thing took deep root in me, the conviction that morality is the basis of all things, that truth is the substance of all this morality. Truth became my sole objective, and my definition of it also have been ever widening. A Gujarati stanza likewise gripped my mind and heart. Its precept, return good for evil, became my guiding principle, unquote, from his autobiography, part 1, chapter 10. Gandhi's belief in personality, morality, though not invested in common faith, did not comprise of his religion alone. For instance, on one occasion he remarks, quote, he says, "It becomes my conviction that procreation and the consequent care of children were inconsistent with public service. During the difficult marches that had then to be performed, the idea flashed upon me that if I wanted to devote myself to the service of my community, I must relinquish the desire for children and wealth and live the life of a vanaprastha," which is a person who lives in, within the forests. Of one retired from household cares, the brief period proved to be a very important epoch in my life. The importance of vows grew upon me more clearly than ever before. I realized that a vow, far from closing the door to real freedom, opened it. I realized that in refusing to take a vow, man was drawn into temptation, and to be bound by a vow was like a passage from libertinism to a real monogamous marriage. Again, from his autobiography, part 3, chapter 8. On another occasion, in relation to the practices of oath-taking, he explained, quote, "Pledges and vows are and should be taken on rare occasions. Only those who take a pledge can be bound by it. A pledge must not be taken with a view to produce an effect on outsiders. Everyone must search in his own heart, and if the inner voice assures him that he has the requisite strength to carry him through, then only should he pledge himself." Unquote, chapter 12. This Gandhi was a character who was not just difficult to understand, but deliberately dwelt within the interstices of both reason and faith. However, he has probably been the greatest phenomenon that the Indian nation has ever witnessed. Thus, we have a figure before us who is a philosopher without being a theorist, a statesman without being strictly political, a mystic without being absorbed into mysticism, and a great communicator without being always understood. He was the character who founded his politics on intense personal, even spiritual experiences and sought to test them to the mundaneness of experiment. I mean, he calls his experiences as experiment in his autobiography. His endeavors were intensely political without being material alone. He asserts, quote, "But I should certainly like to narrate my experiments in the spiritual field, which are known only to myself, from which I have derived such power and as I possess for working in the political field. What I want to achieve, what I have been striving and pining to achieve these 30 years is self-realization, to see God face to face, to attain moksha." Moksha is basically the liberation from the cycle of life and birth. I mean, life and death, basically. Yeah. The outcome is thus a spectacular anti-colonial movement in the Indian subcontinent. Gandhi's methodology to counter British colonialism lay chiefly in a spiritual ritual called the Satyagraha, which was also the only political tool he espoused. He called Satyagraha to be of quote-unquote sterner stuff. He says there is nothing reserved and nothing secret about this particular, methodology. In this struggle, a satyagrahi had to engage with laws, morality, and the question of violence as much as in any other emancipatory movement. In his words, quote, "A satyagrahi obeys the laws of society intelligently and of his own free will because he considers it to be his sacred duty to do so. It is only when a person has thus obeyed his laws that he is in a position to judge as to which particular rules are good and just and which are unjust and iniquitous. My quote, after a few lines, my error lay in my failure to observe the necessary limitation." Basically, he defines what a satyagrahi ideally should be. Gandhi's moral law was therefore not traceable to the state or theology, but stemmed out of a greater experience of the self, that which forms the plinth again of my paper. In his firmness for truth or satyagraha, Gandhi is continuously aware of the experiential nature of truth and hence looks into the symbols of religiosity to inform his quest. He seeks liberation and truth both in terms of politics and spirit, for he understands, quote, "But Swaraj has to be experienced by each one of us. One drowning man can never save the other. Slaves ourselves, it would merely be a pretension to free others." Unquote. This is from Hind Swaraj, page 57. It is experience which mattered to Gandhi. Again, quote, "What we have tested and found true on the anvil of experience, we dare not change." Page 54, Hind Swaraj. It was experience or anubhuti in the Indic, that's the Indic term, the Indian term. Anubhuti, which was at the core of his soul force which was actually associated with the idea of the soul and satyagraha both. Hence, I propose to understand Gandhi through this very context. Anubhuti or experience resists the realm of reason and hence of language. or of any other structural formation. In addition to this, Anubhuti can never be approached by faith or belief alone. It is not that which is collectively presumed or professed to be true when learned from the testimonies of another. Anubhuti is not transmissible, either through the politics of spectatorship or followed through the axiomatic of communication. I contend that it is performative, political, and also aesthetic. Before elucidating on it further, it may be imperative to dwell on these ideas a little more. Let us look at Gandhi through his own politics in this context. M.K. Gandhi's overt admission on the importance of reason and conscience to delicate matters like caste, religion, or even political opposition always stood in some sort of a dialectical relation to his continual belief in certain core ideas, let's say, which concerned diet. I mean, his diet was basically something which he derived from his Vaishnavite mother. His idea of ahimsa, incidentally, Gandhi's guru was a Jain monk. So the idea of ahimsa is very integral to the very understanding of, Jain religious system. The belief in unity of life, which is actually noted by a scholar named Eknath Eswaran, the pursuit of the singular God in quotidian shows of life, or the belief in the soul as the absolute locus of this divinity. He also talks about Tolstoy, the idea that kingdom lies from, within, that idea too. These are all impressions which he had collected from others even before he experimented with them. Hence, the suggestion is that Gandhi obviously qualified the faculty of reason with his beliefs, and hence, perhaps, the very conception of conscience for Gandhi comprised both faith and rationality, often in a tension whose resolution impelled him to move far beyond them. In this regard, it will also be interesting to note that Gandhi's initial days as a lawyer was difficult in India. He admits to not knowing the use of laws, as he believed that law is successful only in social communication and in a state of empathy. This law is a different kind of law he talks about, of course. It is only in British Natal, Transvaal, and Orange colonies, which is in the South African continent, where he learned to use law as an instrument of protest and resistance. Gandhi's copiously drafted legal petitions were all intellectual and even academic, but largely limited to his days in South Africa and the initial decade of his political ambition in India. In terms of literature, Gandhi's writings reveal a marked transformation both in form and the style of presentation. His legal drafts meant for contestations at the court gradually transformed into his formal but subjective writings in newspapers which upheld the plight of Indians in South Africa, which is in the Indian opinion, which my previous speaker already spoke about, which meant to appeal to a different pivot of power, that is, the conscience of the colonizers and the colonized alike. His editorials developed its social character more intensely through time before developing into personal confessions, which is in the form of diary writing, and his autobiography, which ran parallelly with his editorials. Hence, Gandhi at this stage was addressing his own self as much as the broader society and the colonial state. This development achieved its apotheosis in India right at the peak of the anti-colonial movement, which is 1925 onwards. This observation is significant on two grounds. To begin with, Gandhi's contestations were directed towards the colonial state and its apparatus, which were the centers that monopolized power. Thus, Gandhi semi-consciously admitted to the narrow definition of power, which was tailored by the colonial state itself. His literary investments in newspapers indicated that he was shifting the gravity of this power to public will and conscience while addressing the state simultaneously with its subjects, and sometimes through them. Finally, through confessional writings, Gandhi widens the liminalities of power to the self with the state and the collective conscience of the society. To him, the self is as much a site of contestation as much as all social relations or the impersonal state. Each is equally a pedestal of judgment as the other two. Hence, Gandhi embarks on a journey that democratizes the very boundaries of power, thus breeding within it the seeds of protest. The other point which may be noted is that Gandhi's journey of redefining power transpires to the impersonal, the public, and the personal to finally dissolve every distinction amongst the three. Thus, Gandhi's politics was being constructed on the plinth where the political could be approached to the social and the material, and where all the three bore profound relations to the spiritual. Thus, Gandhi's quest was to sublimate the politics of ends and means into a form of pure politics, which addressed and interacted with the social and political to finally find its contentment in the soul. Of course, the concept of soul now assumes the central ground for most theological and spiritual discourses. Gandhi, about whom we have sufficient research to believe. I mean, we already spoke about his Jain guru Rajchandra, his Vaishnavite parents. He's coming across this English translation of the Bhagavad Gita, which was done by Edwin Arnold. Tilak, I mean, he's also a very important figure in Indian independence movement, Bal Gangadhar Tilak. his Gita Rahasya, and also he was actually researching on the idea of ahimsa, which was there in Buddhism. So there is sufficient research to believe that he was conscious about the Indic heritage. It brought the soul into the cynosure of his politics. Soul is already it is conceived as one of the 9 dravyas in Hindu Astika school of thought, which is the Mimamsa school basically. This was to Gandhi a reservoir of impressions which had an active character as well. The soul has force and appeal. It communicates to the sattva, which is the purest quality in all beings, often emotive and even divine, of the soul. In other words, it is the deepest experience of conscience within a being that relates to the divine sentiments and is aroused by it. Etymologically, the word sattva comprises sat, which means truth, and va indicates the specificity, that which qualifies a substance. Incidentally, Gandhi was appealing to this quality of truth through his method called satyagraha. This appeal to the sattva was Gandhi's politics of purity. Appeal was integral to Gandhi's satyagraha, as Louis Fisher, who has actually edited an entire volume on Gandhi. It's called The Essential Gandhi. That's the name of the text. He notes, appeal was the key to Gandhi's politics. He appealed to the common sense and morality of his adversary. To Gandhi, appeal to the purest quality of truth lay in the force of the sattva then. Gandhi's satyagraha then is a performance of communication and appeal. However, I contend that these terms do not qualify the real essence of the soul and its force. Sattvic communication, it is not just a mechanical process. It associates with the innermost entity of the being and becomes its own part. This union of the message with the person's sattva leads to anubhuti or experience. In other words, sattvic communication is a communion through and by the sattva of individuals. This communion leads to the possibility of authentic and internal experience. Therefore, I contend that Gandhi's appeal has an element which is fundamental to both his spiritual and political understanding. It is the aesthetics of his communication. In this context, one may actually, refer back to Walter Benjamin again in his the work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. He talks against the aestheticization of politics, and he prefers to politicize aesthetics as such. However, I suggest that it is not either the question around aestheticization of politics or the politicization of aesthetics that will be relevant in this regard. In fact, my argument is against this very framework of binary understanding. In Gandhi, I argue, it is his politics which is built on a certain form of aesthetics, just as his aesthetics is his politics itself. In other words, the relationship of instrumentality remains suspended, but one is inexorably constituted to the other. Thus, I suggest that to Gandhi, the politics of soul was qualified through the aesthetics of communication. This complex relationship between Gandhi's politics and aesthetics was consumed through his method of struggle, which he has termed as the satyagraha, which is satyagraha for him. So I propose to understand Gandhi or what may be roughly understood as Gandhiism or Gandhivad, as one must look into the performative aspect of it. Gandhi's appeal, as already mentioned, did not lay in his language or in reason alone. His entire idea revolved around this aspect of soul and spirituality and satya. So satyagraha, that was basically about the experience of truth that I already referred to, which has to be individually experienced. Gandhi's truth was about the realization of God. In other terms, it was about the experience of unity of life while respecting the multiplicity of ways and forms of existence. In this context, one may explore Gandhi's insistence on a certain ritualism and religiosity along with the repetition and practice in everyday life, which was to be followed in the ashrams that he had established in India. So to understand Gandhi's, aesthetics, basically, I look at this classical Indian text called Natya Shastra, which actually talks about the concept of Natya, which is basically performance or enactment. And in that Natya Shastra, in that particular text, we have 4 forms of Natya, which has been spoken about. The first being the Vachika Abhinaya, which is spoken enunciation. Next is Aharika Abhinaya, which is costume or appeal. Angika Abhinaya, which is bodily performance, and Satvika Abhinaya, which was the most important form to appeal to the Sattva. I contend that Gandhi's Abhinaya can be traced through all these 4 forms, which finally sought to appeal to the Sattva of his followers. It is interesting to note that the word Abhinaya is also replete with a suggestion. It emphasizes the ability to transport oneself to a higher order of identity without destroying the material realities of individual existence. The Natya Shastra details on the significance of this basic communication. And Natya Shastra also talks about this idea of performance in terms of 2 major concepts, which is the bhava and the rasa. Bhava is basically the mental state that one undergoes, or the kind of disposition that one receives or invokes within himself the dominant mental state, and rasa is basically the aesthetic pleasure that comes out of it. Now, for this particular purpose, I look into the ideas of bhava and rasa in a more in another way altogether. Interestingly, this process has invited a lot of commentary from classical Indian theorists. For instance, Bhattanayaka elaborates more on this process and asserts that it is the experience of the bhava and the rasa which is universalized, which is called sadharanikarana. Such universalization allows the spectator to drive all the worldly attachments of his immediate identity to blend into the experience of the performer or the natyakar. This comprises the appeal to the sattva. Bhavakatva again becomes a very important term over here, which is at the central aspect of sattvic communication. So Bhavakatva actually allows you to blend into the experience of the natyakar. Subsequently, the experience of the universal, which is unity, leads to the experience of bliss, which has also been termed as Bhojakatva in the Natya Shastra. So let us look at certain.
We're going to have to wrap it up in another minute or two to make time for everyone else. So if you arrive at your conclusion very soon.
Yes, I'll try to wrap it up very soon. So I'll just touch upon the major points that I was trying to talk about. So Gandhi's Abhinay, when we talk about that aspect, let us take the example of Hind Swaraj, where Gandhi himself splits his personality into two, the reader and the editor. And there's a conversation that goes on between these two, characters altogether. And there's a critic called Aditya Nigam who also talks about this entire dramatization, almost visual oral dramatization in a way, as an ontological drama. So here Gandhi actually speaks to his readers as the editor himself, and he takes every point which was there present in the popular conception, which went against Gandhi's ideas. For example, the idea of culture and civilization and sovereignty. And over there, Gandhi actually, he doesn't talk about, this entire philosophy of his only in terms of language, but he talks about a particular conception of unity, which I contained is actually understandable to the bhava, let us say the Vishmaya bhava, which is the very fact, the very idea of astonishment, which actually brings every human being and his sattva together, and the rasa, which is the Adbhuta rasa, which takes a central point, which becomes a central, prospect or the medium of his communication. Similarly, we find when he was spearheading this movement, which is called the Dandi March in the year 1930, we also find that Gandhi talks about bravery, or there is this idea of the Veena rasa, which is being conveyed to his followers. Interestingly, he never instructs his followers in language. He only, kind of leads them to Dandi to protest against the salt tax. And there is this idea of some kind of aesthetic communication which goes on within this performance. That is an idea of his Angika performance, Angika Abhinay. The other example might be his, his interest in spinning the wheel, which is both, economically important as it is spiritually also depicting the idea or the symbol of time. So that too actually talks about this idea of, Veera Rasa and the idea of Adbhuta Rasa altogether, which talks about unity of time, which is spirituality and materiality together. Similarly, we also have this idea of Aharya Abhinay, let us say, when Gandhi actually, he embodies himself in khadi, which becomes a garment of both anti-colonial protest. At the same point of time, he doesn't speak much about the about the symbolic aspect of wearing the khadi. It's only in economic terms that he talks about it. But it himself, his own body, when it is costumed into that khadi, becomes a site of protest. So that too talks about bhava and rasa and how they are being communicated to the other in a form of sattvic communication. And finally, of course, we also talk about Satvika, Abhinay, which is the Satyagraha, which is also about suffering. In his suffering, Gandhi actually talks about the idea that you need to actually get into violence first, know how to suffer and get out of that violence through courage, and then only you become an ideal person who can practice Satyagraha. So in look at the testimonies of his associates like Mahadev Desai or Manu Gandhi or even Nirmal Kumar Bose, you will see that they actually, they speak about Gandhi's suffering in graphic details. So this idea of suffering, which is again very important in the Natya Shastra incidentally lists down quite a number of, bhavas and how, suffering is an integral part of Satvik Abhinay. And that is something which Gandhi does through his sattvic abhinay and communication. So basically, my proposal is to look at Gandhi from the idea of aesthetics, which would form the core of his politics as such. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, thank you. And I think, Cogen, this sets you up quite nicely.
I believe it does.
So go forward.
All right, let's do it. Okay, everybody can see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for having me here, and thank you, Dr. Chappell, for doing such a wonderful job organizing such a fascinating conference and an excellent panel. I really enjoyed everybody's talk a lot. It's really an honor to be on this one. My talk today is an interesting topic. It's Mahatma Gandhi. I'm really leaning into the interfaith aspect of this panel. Mahatma Gandhi and what's called commonly the 3 A's of Jainism. Okay, so I have a lot to say about this, and really at the heart of this is the issue of what exactly is religious identity. And that's really a question that I want to hone in on because we're talking about interfaith dialogue and goodwill. One of the things that comes up often is what is the nature of hybridized in religious identities and what types of religious identities are legitimate, what types are not. How do we designate somebody else's religious identity and how do we designate our own in relationship to other religious communities? And so a lot of this, the genesis of this topic has come from my observations of the Jain community with which I work very closely. And I have a lot of conversations about Mahatma Gandhi, and his name comes up quite a bit. And there seems to be a certain sense of kinship between the Jain community, at least the diasporic Jain community that I tend to associate a lot with. There's a sort of sense of kinship between Mahatma Gandhi and the Jain community and a certain blurring of religious distinctions between Gandhi as a Hindu and the Jain community who take a certain sense of, for lack of a better word, maybe ownership of Gandhi. And of course, this is obvious, seeing that the Jain tradition is centered on nonviolence. And Mahatma Gandhi is perhaps one of the greatest proponents of nonviolence in the modern era. And so I think that Jains tend to see him as really exemplifying some of these central Jain religious concepts. And through Gandhi's actions, his success in nonviolent civil disobedience, in his nonviolent activism, in his Hind Swaraj movement, that success seems to sort of provide a pragmatic justification for the religious truth claims of the Jain tradition, which if you've listened to me speak in other contexts, Jainism, interfaith dialogue, and pragmatism is very much at the core of what I work with. I'm writing a book on the topic currently as well. So I'm a renegade history major as an undergraduate, but I'm very fortunate that as an undergraduate in my history degree, a lot of the question that was asked in the department was whether history was a social science or a humanity. And at the heart of that question was epistemology. How much should historians be constrained to objectivism and empiricism as a social science? And how much can we employ a first-person standpoint? Something like a philosophical question, right? So there's some historians in the social science thought that would say that we should never ask what history could have been because there's no way of knowing what people would have done or what they would do today. Those are sort of outside of the realm of empiricism and objectivism. But then there's another humanities approach to history that says that we very much can ask these types of philosophical questions because they really sort of root out a sort of phenomenological hermeneutic of the our own force structures and our own ideas, how they interact with the object of our historical study, and then what emerges from that. And this is very Gadamerian, right? So Gandhi was obviously quite Hindu. He is very much recognized as that. But he was also had a very hybridized approach to religion that I'm going to sort of unearth and discuss a little bit here. So if we were going to answer, now of course I'm not going to try to answer this question because it is actually an impossible question. Was Gandhi Jain? But a lot can come out of answering these types of philosophical questions. If you were to say, yes, Gandhi was a Jain or is a Jain or, can be considered Jain, you would have to show a certain line of thinking that would help you really think deeply about the topic. Or if you were to answer no, the same thing happens, right? So really this gets to the heart of is our own philosophical and theological commitments about like what religious identity is it possible to have hybridized religious identities, and what exactly constitutes a religious identity. So when we find the Jain tradition, really centers around the three A's of Jainism: ahimsa, aparigraha, and anikantavad. And we see that Gandhi made quite a bit of use of at least the first two of these, and really cited the third one quite strongly as well too. So in a sense, we can see that Gandhi is not only asserting central Jain doctrine, but he's also putting it into practice. So in this way, that which is central to the Jain tradition, he's both advocating theoretically and practically, right? So to what degree then would we say that Gandhi was a Jain practitioner? If he's practicing the central practices of Jainism, then is he a Jain practitioner? Or to what degree does that just make him an advocate of Jainism? And how could we categorize his relationship to the Jain tradition, or actually really any other religious tradition? And I'm sure that anybody who studied Gandhi at any length realizes how rich his theology was in terms of trying to sort of solve the question of the world's religions. So I'm just going to suggest how we can understand that relationship and some of the ways that we can think about that without actually attempting to answer it. So asking the question is much more important than getting the answer. So whether or not he's considered to be a Jain, whether we might call him a Jain or not, it really is obvious that he was a great component of, or proponent of central Jain teachings. And as I said, through what we might call the pragmatic maxim, the idea that the truth, the veracity of a truth claim is evidenced by putting it into practice, then he provided quite a bit of evidence for the veracity of Jain truth claims, the power of nonviolence, the spiritual power, the social power. So we can say in some ways he was out there proving Jain doctrine and Jain beliefs, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about how to define religious identity. So if you've been in religious studies for any amount of time and you've studied it from an objective point of view, as an empiricist, scholars of religion will often say that a religion is simply what people say it is. And they'll caution not to essentialize religion, like I may have just done when I talked about the three A's as being central or essential to Jain tradition. From a sort of objectivist, empiricist standpoint, that would be bad scholarship. However, fortunately, I'm a philosopher, so I don't have to worry about the constraints of empiricism and objectivism, right? So at the heart of this is really a religious tradition is whatever people from that tradition say it is based on the total history of the tradition, both the theoretical and practical components. Now, if you talk to religious people themselves, if you do constructive theology, like I've been known to do, we see something quite opposite happening. So if the objectivist and the empiricist says you can't essentialize, and religion is just whatever religious people say it is, insiders do the opposite. They say that this is the core to the tradition, this is peripheral to the tradition, we need to let go of the peripheral stuff so we can focus on the core teachings. And that really is the basic impulse of religious theology. You're trying to sort of show that somebody else's presentation of a faith is not the best representation of the faith, right? That's how theology works. It is really very much essentializing the traditions. So arguably, Jains would consider the three A's to be essential to Jainism. You can try this by talking to a lot of Jains or just listening to how many times you hear three A's in the Jain context, right? So the question then becomes, anybody who practices the triple A's, are they a Jain? And when you listen to Jains talk, sometimes it very much sounds like that, right? Do they have to accept other philosophical notions? What's the relationship between theory and practice here, right? If you practice Jainism, and if practice is central to defining what a religion is, but you don't follow all the philosophical notions, can you still be considered to be part of that religious community? So, for example, Jains are non-monotheistic, they're ontological pluralists, which seems to be at odds with a lot of the theory that Gandhi expresses, right? So in some ways, practically, he's a lot more Jain. In other ways, theoretically, he's a little bit less. So how do we sort of weight that? To what degree is proper philosophy definitive of religious identity? And to what degree is proper practice definitive of religious identity? And I believe that there's an Abrahamic bias to favor philosophy over practice, because your declaration of faith is what defines you in a faith community. You say, I believe in this. right? With Abrahamic traditions, that's generally how you become part of that tradition. I believe in this. And then what you practice and what you do, that's there, but it's kind of secondary. So I think there's a certain Abrahamic, maybe even Western bias to define religions primarily philosophically and practically only secondarily. But I question whether that is proper. Maybe practice is more central to religion. And again, sometimes you hear Jains say, oh, well, that person is practically a Jain. They're as good as a Jain because they live by ahimsa. Even though they may not ascribe to the theory, the practice seems to be sufficient for some Jains to consider other people, like Gandhi, is included within their own religious identity, right? So that's a very interesting question. So I think many Jains would agree that practical aspects are at least as important and maybe even more important than theoretical. And that's at the heart of the pragmatism that I've been advocating for. So how do we understand Gandhi's relationship to the Jain faith? If he seems to be a practitioner, right? And he advocates for central aspects of the Jain tradition. So that's really at the heart of our question here. So let's explore Gandhi's relationship with the Jain tradition a little bit more by talking about Satyagraha, which we've heard quite a bit about today. In the nonviolent studies, there's often a distinction between strategic and principled nonviolence. Gandhi tends to be the poster child for principled nonviolence. I won't go into that too much. It's also something of a false binary because principled advocates of principled nonviolence tend to think that they're strategically the best option as well, too. But anyway, with Satyagraha, we see this sort of like almost two-part structure of withdrawing from cooperation with systems of injustice, right? And then only once that's been done and as a sort of last resort, engaging in civil disobedience where you actually might break laws. And you can see many examples in Gandhi's history where he actually resisted civil disobedience because he felt that withdrawing from cooperation had not sufficiently been done. So there's sort of like almost this two-tiered structure, but really at the base of this is a very principled approach of cultivation of one's character is the way to change the world, right? And we see that with the eschewing of violence, the adoption of poverty, and here we can see that a Satyagrahi has to aspire to become a perfect man, perfect person, I think we would say in our modern lexicon. So it's very much a principled approach. And at the heart of this is the importance of vows, because vows are considered in Dharma traditions to be transformative of the character, and through transforming the character, then you transform society. So Gandhi referred to vows as a bulwark of strength. It's a source of spiritual cultivation, and it's necessary to develop one's character that one will need to endure suffering, which any social activist will. You know, I've been married to a very intense social activist for about 25 years, and she's one of the bravest people I know, and she's endured quite a bit of suffering. She lived in a tree for a couple months to save the trees. She has been arrested many times, which is a badge of honor, you know, for civil disobedience. And there's a lot of suffering that goes into that. Is encouraged too. And that's a sort of tapasya, right? You know, so the vows really prepare you for that. When you have voluntary self-denial, you come to become equiposed in situations of discomfort, and the vows really do that. Now, another important relationship between Gandhi's vows and Jainism happens when Gandhi goes to leave for England to study as a barrister. His mother was afraid that he would be engaged in debauchery, so she had him take the vows not to touch wine, women, or meat, right? Because, of course, he was married at the time, and he took that vow in the presence of a Jain monk, right? We can see this here in the citations on the bottom. To sort of help his mother feel at ease. But of course, the power of those vows really led to his spiritual curiosity, his personal cultivation, and he came to believe that actually Satyagrahis need to take vows in order to gain those benefits that he himself experienced at such a young age when he took those initial vows under the tutelage of a Jain monk. All right. So we can look at the Satyagraha vows. While Gandhi was studying in England, he came across the Yoga Sutra. The yamas were very central to him. Yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, parigraha. very central and influential. They become the Satyagrahi ashram vows. They're present as the Mahavratas and Anuvratas in Jainism. They're also present in Buddhism. And then also the Yoga Sutra, Ahimsa Pratistayam Tat Samnidhau Vairvya Tyaga, that in the presence of one who's cultivated nonviolence, those who are violent will abandon their hostility. That's a very important sutra in the Yoga Sutra that very much inspired Gandhi. But in terms of the 3 A's, let's look at the 2 main vows of Ahimsa and Aparigraha, which are 2 of the 3 A's that Jains will often cite as the 3 A's of Jainism. Right? So if we think about social change as a sort of dialectical tension that happens between the powers of the state and of systematic violence versus the power of those who resist, right? If the state doesn't have very much power and the people who resist have a lot of power, social change happens. If the people who resist don't have much power and people who are maintaining the status quo have a lot of power, social change doesn't happen. It's just a sort of dialectical tension. It's almost Hegelian there. That happens, right? And so from that perspective, Gandhi saw himself as employing the most powerful weapon, which is the greatest weapon of mankind, and that is the power of nonviolence. And of course, he saw this as the power that Jesus employed in the Sermon on the Mount. He saw the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as employing this power. He saw great people throughout history as employing this, and he thought that the balance of love and nonviolence was far greater in humanity than violence. For example, all the instances where people love their children, people love their neighbors, the friendly interactions that we have with people daily, that far outweighs the negative interactions that humanity has. So we're defined by nonviolence as a humanity. And so following the strategy of nonviolence will then overpower the structural violence. And that was very much at the heart of it. And this is very much also a path of spiritual development, as I've pointed out. Now, this is also very much related to karma theory, that's embraced by Jains and others, where basically if one is to express spiritually, then one has to mitigate how much karma one produces. And the way that one produces karma is by creating harm. So we have to really interrogate our actions to see all the various different subtle forms of violence that we're committing every day and mitigate that so that our karma is no longer obstructing the full expression of our soul's power, right? Satyagraha is power, as Ayan said there. So therefore, one should never retaliate. Any sort of retaliation is a crime against humanity. We shouldn't even punish those who harm us or harm society. We should practice forbearance. And all of that is very much at the heart of Gandhian nonviolence, which I think is very well known. Now, the Aparigraha Vrata of Satyagraha, Aparigraha is like non-consumption, right? Gandhi often translates it as non-possession. So when he's talking about non-possession, he's usually thinking about aparigraha. You can see the relationship between those 2 terms. So no matter what we do when we consume, I don't care if you're buying organic, vegan, local, homespun khadi, there's still violence on the supply chain. There's violence in agriculture, there's violence in transportation, there's violence to human laborers. There's always violence. Anytime you consume anything economically, you're engaging in violence. Now, it's not to say it's all the same. There's obviously some products that you can buy that are much more violent and some that are much less. So we aspire towards less. But really, that's basically at the heart of it, that one of the main ways that we get rid of our karma is to consume less, because all forms of consumption are a form of violence, right? And of course, this will have social and economic implications. Dr. Howard was quick to point out that if you follow a Gandhian model, where's the oil industry? Where does that lead the oil industry? It's a village economy, but it's also one that's based on like very, very scarce or sparse consumption, which would address like most of the problems in the world today in terms of economic distribution, global warfare, capital, distribution of wealth, environment. All of that would be addressed if we just consumed less. All right. So like Jains, Gandhi saw that relationship between possession, consumption, and violence. So where there's perfect love, there must be perfect non-possessing. Now, also like the Jains, he saw that is involving a sort of sacrifice of the body. Right. So for Jains, the ideal is to ultimately practice salekana, right, which is a fasting to death. right? So you're so nonviolent, you're so committed to not harming anyone else that you'll let your body just sort of wither away. Obviously, this is not suicide. This is very different. But the idea that the body itself is inherently connected to violence and that we need to withdraw from that system of violence as well, too. Well, Gandhi has some very interesting ideas about the body as being a possession, and therefore it's kind of part of the whole violence, and that we have to sort of sacrifice our bodies in a way to contribute to nonviolence in the name of a parigraha, right? And the way we sacrifice is we courageously face the oppressors, get thrown in jail, get beaten, and all of that. Be prepared to embrace death and renounce the body for the sake of human service. Very courageous stuff there. Okay, so those are a couple more well-known aspects of Gandhi's advocating of central Jain doctrine, but those two are also very much shared by the other Dharma traditions. But Anekantavad, the third of the three A's of Jainism, is very much a Jain philosophy. And Dr. Christopher Miller and I are working on a volume right now on engaged Jainism. And we just accepted a paper from Dr. Jeffrey Long. And Jeffrey Long makes this sort of wonderful argument. He asks the question of, can you come to Anekantavad from a different philosophical point of view? So he asks, he shows how this sort of inquiry through Vedanta will lead one to a Jain idea of Anekantavad, which is very, very fascinating. So even though Anekantavad per se is sort of like a characteristic of the Jain tradition, it seems to make Jainism stand out from other traditions. Dr. Long argues that actually other traditions can come up with very similar ideas. All right, so that's, again, makes our inquiry today a little bit more complex. So for Gandhi, he cites Anekantavad as an interfaith ideal, much the same way that Jains cite Anekantavada today. Okay, so really what Gandhi is trying to do is he's trying to approach religious conflict. I mean, that's the deal, right? Primarily the Hindu-Muslim conflict, right? There's also Christian overtones with colonialism. There's other issues going on there too, but that's certainly one of the main things that Gandhi's interested in is getting rid of the religious conflict. And he sees a sort of theologies of religions, as Paul Knitter would use the term, is being the key to ending interreligious conflict. That sort of ability to find equal value within traditions and to reconcile the seemingly irreconcilable traditions. Now, this starts to get a little bit problematic when you start looking at Gandhi's staunch theism, right? He really believed that God is central to satyagraha. If you do not believe in God and have faith in God, you are not a true satyagrahi, right? Which, I mean, on the one hand, yeah, that can unify Hindus and Muslims. But on the other hand, what about like Jains and Buddhists, and those other religions that don't necessarily have a God per se? Well, he even admits that Buddhist and Jain doctrines are disqualified from satyagraha if they do not admit the existence of God. So this hardly sounds like finding value in all different religious traditions. This very much sounds like sort of diminishing the value of other religious traditions. And I have the full quote there, which, we don't need to read it, but he just says they would be disqualified if they don't have faith in God, Buddhists and Jains specifically. Right? Non-theistic Buddhists and non-theistic Jains. However, again, if you've hung out with Jains for any amount of time, you'll notice how often they use the term God. We worship God, we love God, we have faith in God. Talk is not necessarily something that Jain communities are resistant to, even though they're not monotheistic, right? I would consider Jains to be plural theistic, where there's, the highest form of divinity is within each and every individual being, right? There's not like some single transcendental being that's the locus of all value, but the locus of value is within all individuals. And that locus of value, that divinity, is often referred to as God by English-speaking Jains because they're really just translating the terms like Bhagavan or Ishwara or these other terms that Jains have no problem using. It just means something differently. So Gandhi clearly allows for Jain theology to be godly, right? And we see this with Srimad Rajchandra in his autobiography, right? He says that Srimad Rajchandra, the great Jain teacher, has a passion to see God face to face, and he was engaged in godly pursuits.
and he uses very theistic language with Srimad Rajchandra. Now, he knew that Srimad Rajchandra was philosophically opposed to monotheism because they were corresponding in letters. Gandhi said that he'd never met anybody on the planet who he could consider a guru. He thought there was probably nobody who was that high of a station in life, living today. However, he referred to Srimad Rajchandra as a spiritual guide. And during that time in UK, when he was having a crisis of faith, they were corresponding with letters. And one of the questions Gandhi asked was about monotheism, which Srimad Rajchandra rejected, and he rejected some other ideas of Hinduism. But then when Gandhi said, well, should I be a Jain then? Gandhi said, no, you can be liberated just fine. Or Srimad said, no, you can be liberated just fine as a Hindu, right? So Gandhi sees Jains as godly and wanting to see God face to face, whatever that might mean. So he's willing to admit that this prerequisite for being a Satyagrahi is having faith in God is applicable to whatever the Jain ideas of divinity, right? Which, like I said, I would consider it a plural theism, not a polytheism, but a plural theism. Okay, so Gandhi explicitly employs Anekantavad to try to make sense of contradictory religious truth claims, much the same way that a lot of modern Jains do. And he says that all religions are true. That's his assumption. And all religions have error in them. This looks like the first two stages of the Jain syllogism, Syadvada, Asti Nasti, right? Syat Asti, Syat Nasti, right? It's a dialectical thesis antithesis. All religions are true. All religions are in some way non-true. Syat, in some way, all religions are true. Syat, in some way, all religions are not true, right? And then the synthesis is that they can, as long as they're not true and untrue at the same time in the same way, to paraphrase Aristotle, they can still be synthesized, right? Which is what how the Jain dialectic operates. So therefore, he concludes that my own veneration for other faiths is the same as for his own faith, right? And he's doing this by citing Anekantavad as well, too. So he is really employing Jain teachings to show his comfort with seeming contradictory nature of contrasting religious truth claims, which would be, I think, a characteristic of somebody who has a truly hybridized religious identity. There's different hybridized religious identities. There's those who have a secondary identity that they consider to be subordinate to their primary religious identity. Like they believe one tradition is more true, but they identify with strong elements of another tradition. But a stronger hybridized identity, arguably, would be that all traditions are of equal value, right? And that one is not more true or less true. And how to deal with relativism is another problem there. But at the same time, that seems to be how Gandhi is employing Jain teachings. There's this very strong valuation of other religious traditions, which is what Anekantavad is a way of disagreeing with somebody, maintaining your disagreement, but finding the maximum value in their position. And I talk a lot about that if you've ever heard me talk about Jainism and interfaith dialogue. Okay, so here's an example of how he cites Anekantavad and Syadvad, which are, Jain teachings. He says, I'm a Hindu Advaitist. I can support Hindu Dvaitism. The world is changing every moment and therefore is unreal. It has no permanent existence. But though it's constantly changing, there's something about it which persists and is therefore real. So the first one would be supposedly a Dvaita position. The second one would be an Advaita position. And he has no objective to saying that they're both right. In some ways, it is real. In some ways, the world is unreal, right? In some ways. That's Syat from the Jain Anekantavad. And so therefore, he's going to say he's an Anekantavadi. This sounds like straight out of any Jain discussion of Syadvada in terms of its interfaith implications. So this sounds really like, he's saying he is an Anekantavadi. That's basically saying he is a Jain, sort of, right? It's pretty close to it. So he's really using Anekantavada as an intellectual himsa, as a way of finding valuation in other traditions and therefore creating interfaith goodwill, which is essential for our quelling religious conflict, right? So
Cogen, I think we have to really sort of wrap it up, and then that again brings us, you're there at the conclusion, and that brings us straight into the conversation of interfaith.
Okay, sounds good.
Great. So Abu, the platform is yours.
Are you listening me?
Yes, please.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, moderator, and regards to all participants, panelists, and other guests. My article will be a different. The name of my article is Interfaith Dialogue in Bangladesh and its implications from a long history. But in my country, Mahatma Gandhi is a famous person in different stages, especially our society, in our educational institutions. And in Bangladeshi peoples said that or believe that Mahatma Gandhi is a key personality or great teachers, especially his two teachings, Satyagraha and Ahimsa, is the great teachings, and many of our peoples are follow the two types of teachings. And many Bangladeshis believes that non-violence is the great or highest religions for humanity. Or in that perspective, in our community, Mahatma Gandhi is a very respectable person. But my article will be a very much different. But these articles or these teachings are very much influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. So I'd like to discuss very briefly in my from my article because time is so limited. Interfaith dialogue in Bangladesh, its implications or its necessity. Dialogue between adherents of different religions is more vital than ever. Lack of harmony amongst people is a major issue in today's world. Efforts of foster peace and understanding respective traditions, founding principles, and most pressing issues. Furthermore, it has to promote mutual understanding among the different groups involved in order to lessen the misunderstanding that lead the intergroup conflict. In spite of this country's frozen conflicts, ethnic and religious tensions in Bangladesh remain high. Numerous conflicts might arise in the area of presented factors such as status, poor economic and political situation, corruption, the complex relationship between ethnic groups, a lack of trust, and the expansions of the extremist organizations. After a half century, after the end of the war in Bangladesh, one of the most pressing needs is still is same, rebuilding trust and national unity. Concern about peace building and community harmony have arisen as pressing challenges in Bangladesh's post-conflict society. The future of the nation depends on a successful strategy for restoring calm. It's hardly surprising that these are taboo subjects in Bangladesh. The wounds are still refreshed. Even after all these years, in recent year, several initiatives have been started to promote harmony among the people. The studies, significance, and implications of interfaith conversation contract mostly in religion and religious organizations due to their outsized impact and importance to the quest for the peace. So the purposes of this study to discuss the political, cultural, educational, organizational, and social implications of interfaith dialogue in Bangladesh. Now I discuss political implications of interfaith dialogue, but it will be very constitutional implications. In Bangladesh, the rest of this subcontinent, religious pluralism has always been a fact of life. However, there are still a number of religious festivals that people of many different religious communities together. In addition to peaceful coexistence. This might indicate a genuine courtesy in and pursuit of knowledge about one's neighbors' religious practices. During these religious holidays, people of different faith are said to celebrate together and offer gifts of food and candy of children. Article 2A of Bangladesh's founding constitutions established Islam is a official religion of the Republic, but also guarantees freedom of religion for all citizens. Article 12 of Bangladesh Constitution from 1972 established the country's secular chapter. To be clear, a secular constitution works effectively in a society where many people freely express their religious ideas, feelings, loyalties, rituals, and celebrations. A secular government and religious society may live side by side. Secular is not the absence of religion. Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman said in this speech to the Constituent Assembly of November 4, 1972, as a group, we strongly disagree with the premise that religion may be used as a tool for political gain. Bangladesh has a long history of religious freedom, which has promoted communal understanding among its people of various faith across all society and political strata, so that religion might have a role of political secularism was removed from Bangladesh's constitutions in 1975. Everyone has right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religions, which includes the freedom of change on religions on behalf and the freedom of manifest on religions on behalf in teachings, practices, worship, and observance, whether alone or on the community with other and in public or private, and this right is granted by Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of opinion, consciousness, and the religion, and no one should be forced to give up or abandon in religions or philosophical belief of his own free will. Now I like to share in cultural implication of interfaith dialogue. In today global community, individuals from a variety of background, beliefs, and traditions are discovering more and more points of convergence. There is no part of life in which we not interconnected in depends on another. The religious and cultural origins of our neighbors, colleagues, and friends are diversifying. Consequently, it is rare for people, different faith to join together for various ceremonies, such as a naming ceremony or memorial service for a departed loved one, etc. The ethnic origins of inhabitants of Bangladesh are quite diverse. She has a multicultural upbringing as a consequences. The city's agriculture, literature, dance, theater, music, and art are all influenced by the illustrious past. Even the country's foundation of declaration acknowledges the cultural variety of Bangladeshis inhabitants. Article 23A states that the state must take step of preserve the people's cultural traditions and heritage, and develop and strengthen the country's literacy canon, performing art, and visual arts so that all citizens, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam are the four religions that have had the most influence of Bangladeshi culture. The cultural history of the country resembles a vibrant montage, a symphony of several forms, is peculiar in its own way but essentially balanced. There are a variety of festivals observed in this area, each having its unique meaning for a certain ethnic community. Muslims celebrate several festivals such as Eid al-Fitr, Eid al-Adha, Muharram, and Idul Nabi. The Hindu community observes several holidays, including puja devoted to Durga, Saraswati, and Kali, among others. In Bangla, Christmas is called a Bardin, and is celebrated by our Christian community. In addition, there are few holidays everyone in the country celebrates, regardless of ethnicity or religion. Pohela Boishakh, the first day of Bengali calendar, is an excellent illustrator of this concept. Popular occasions, including Independence Day, National Mourning Day, the Victory Day, and Rabindra and Nazrul Jayanti among the other program. This has happened a consequence of the influence of dialogue in interactions between individuals of many religions. The first known work of Bengali literature goes back around the millennium. Bengali literature thrived during the medieval ages under the patronage of Muslim Sultan. Bengali literature thrived during the middle were extensively read during their time period. The Muslim rulers encouraged them due to their dedications to creating Bengali culture as a uniting force across caste and religions. In the 19th century, Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel Prize winner and a key cultural force in Bengal, is cited in created with the unsharing with the modern period of Bengali literature. Muhammad Kazi Nazrul Islam and Michael Madhusudan Datta, Shatrendra Chandra Gupta, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, Mir Musharraf Hossain, and many other writers they wrote many topics, many poems, many writings. The writings are also relevant in interfaith understanding. Now I discussed the educational implication of interfaith dialogue. Bangladesh's educational concerns encompasses explanation and implicate issues relating the society, ethics, and the particular religious and moral beliefs. It is expected that the national and particularly the public education system would convey values at least partially via religious instructions. The basic and secondary level of public education system in Bangladesh includes secular and religious instruction. Interreligious dialogue has a direct effect of missionary school. Prior to the developments of the interfaith interactions, this was just a pipe dream. Although Christian theology education in Bangladesh was born in the womb of Western missionaries, its almost a 2-century journey has been marked by unique local elements. The Anglican bishops of the Kolkata founded Bishop College, the first institutional theological college. From them, a specific structure of theological education have evolved in this country. Although indigenous theology had not yet been formed, its features started to appear in theological texts, which had a flavor impact on a localized sort of theological education. Christianity has been practiced in Bangladesh for about 500 years, especially Protestant Christianity for almost 300. William Adam, a British priest in missionary, performed a 3-year study of schools in Bengal and the Bihar between 1835 to 1838. During this, which discovered the more than 100,000 rural community run schools exist. These institutions provided instructions in vernacular language, emphasized experienced learning process, presented a broad spectrum of learning topics of skills and were career focused. This school attached students from the variety of social and religious groups of caste. In contrast of this 18 medium, English medium school built and administered by the British, which cared exclusively for children from Hindu upper classes. However, systematic theological education did not begin until the late 19th century. This was fundamental level of Bible study as part of Western missionary activity. In 2005, the colleges of Christian theology in Bangladesh began efforts of Masters of Christian Studies. Andrews also initiated as a BCS and Bachelor of Theology, and others established similar programs in our country. Middle of the 20th century, South Asian embraced religious studies from the West as a missing field of the study. The Indian college started to open their door, the academic study of religious under variety of levels. In 1999, the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh reacted to the need to religious studies by introducing comparative religion in 2000, which was subsequently renamed World Religions and Culture. With the support of the late Professor Dr. Joseph T. Cornell, Dr. Qadirul Islam was instrumental in establishing the department at the University of Dhaka as a functioning core unit. This department was established as the direct outcome of the interreligious dialogue in Bangladesh. Organizational implications of interfaith dialogue. Since 1971, several groups have sought peace via interreligious dialogue. In addition to the many international non-organizational, non-government organizations, local non-government organizations are academic are attempt to set a pattern to interfaith cooperation. Vivekananda, a renowned Hindu spiritual leader, founded the Ramakrishna Mission in 1897. Naming the after Sri Ramakrishna, his guru, Sri Ramakrishna thought that all faiths are valid and lead to the same of the final goal. Caritas Bangladesh has promoted peace since Holy Cross. Father Richard Dickens pioneering the work to create the Justice and Peace Commission after the Bangladeshi Liberation War. This program attempts to enhance the reconciliation capabilities of the emerging constitution. In 2002, the Caritas established the Justice and Peace Program with the aim of promoting reconciliation in violence conflict zones and educating religious liberals of all religions and human rights. The Mennonite Central Committee serves as the church development arm. Its purpose is to proclaim the love of God in the name of Jesus Christ through addressing human needs and the promoting peace. The Mennonite Church is the renowned for the committed the nonviolence and the peace building. In 2007, MCC and another French group, our brother of Teju, launched a mission of promote peace. House of Peace is the name of their Mymensingh headquarters. And finally, I would like to say that the Bangladesh Interreligious Council for Peace and Justice is a non-profit religious organization and work to promote peace in Bangladesh. The country's populations will be more respective friendly contact due to the organization and actives. There are some other organizations such as Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Harmony. This center established in the Dhaka University. This is also this center every year organize different type of program. These programs are relevant in interfaith dialogue or interfaith harmony or interreligious relationship. And finally, last chapter in my article, I would like to share from my viewpoint some social implication of the interfaith dialogue. I'd like to share two examples in recently in my country, the University of Dhaka. Every year they organize a puja, Saraswati Puja. You know, Saraswati Puja is a very interesting puja in Asian subcontinent, especially India and Bangladesh. You know that in our university, 80% people are Muslim and 20% people are Christian, Hindu, and other communities. But they organized a 100 plus mandap, and all of our students, including Muslim, very actively participated that kinds of program, that kinds of puja. So I think that this is our teachings, interfaith dialogue, and they follows the interfaith understanding or the teachings of interfaith dialogue. And they believe that interfaith dialogue is the very core or very core building or very core teachings for humankind. And I would like to share another examples in my university. We have a independent residential hall for indigenous peoples of Bangladesh. In this house, there are Hindu, some Christian, some indigenous religious believers are living there. And just 6 months ago, the very weak part of this hall destroyed, and 60 to 70 students are very much injured. And these students are from different faith. But 100 plus students are Muslims. They donated blood. They donated blood to another religious believers or another religious followers. So I think this is the main teachings of interfaith understanding or interfaith respected points. So that's why in my country is a Muslim-based country, but we love all the religions, all the culture, all the faith, and all the religious believers. So that is the unique points in my country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to affirm, and we have a family friend who grew up in Hawaii. Her name is Basha Chakraborty. She's renowned now as an artist with an MFA from Yale University. And she was invited to Dhaka to participate in that ceremony that you mentioned. And her father, who is from Calcutta, was flabbergasted and said, "What? They're doing pongals in Dhaka?" And his daughter said, "Yes, yes, yes." And I think that this is a very good sign. And my recollection is that there's still about a 10% Hindu population and about a 5% Christian population, in addition to 85% Muslim population. And I think that what we've experienced in the United States with multi-faith communities cooperating with one another is a very good model moving forward. So thank you. And I would also like to, just before we open it up for conversation, celebrate how beautifully these papers fit together. That by talking about Gandhi's aesthetics, by talking about the influences of African-American education on Gandhi, by talking about, and I think Cogen and Abu's paper went together so well, talking about the need for making space for people who do not think or practice the way that others may practice, that this is very, very hopeful. So I see, Veena, you are unmuted, so I think that you're the first to get the next word.
I'm just so thrilled by these papers and, aesthetics that, Ayan Chakraborty wasn't able to finish it. I never seen, I think about Gandhi's aesthetics of his attire and his presentations, but I never saw the connection between the Natya Shastra, and that was like, I will follow up with you about your paper that I can look at it. And Abu, Taher's, that's so fascinating. I think the world, as we see, I grew up among Muslims. My hometown, Muradabad, had a great large population of Muslims. Whole our mohalla was mostly Muslim and very few Hindu families and Sikh families. And how much we celebrated together the Eid, the Holi and the festivals. But when we look at the media and all this, they want to just make these, silos, and these are communities that are always at war. And, it's really is disturbing to me when people talk about Hindu Sikhs or Hindu Sikh Muslims or Hindu Sikh, So I think it's just really cool to have Cogen's paper on Ekantavada to all of you. It's just, I wasn't expecting such a wonderful presentation. So it's wonderful. Thank you.
Well, this has been a delightful evening, and our building is closing. So we have to pack it up and thank everyone for this wonderful time together. It's so, I think, fantastic when people who don't know one another get to know one another, and that's a conference at its best. So I'm glad that we have made one another's acquaintance and look forward to continued communication in future. And please consider putting this together for submission to the journal Monsoon, which we edit here for SASA. And I think that there certainly is a theme, a thread running through all of these. So again, thank you very much. And I'm labeled as Zoom Room 307. I did not properly introduce myself. I'm Christopher Chappell. I'm the president of the South Asian Studies Association and Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology at Loyola Marymount University. So good evening, good morning, and carry on.